Well, I'd like to begin with a confession. When speaking at conferences, I usually hope to come after a long-winded academic who uses very complicated language and impenetrable PowerPoint graphs. So I do have to say I'm feeling deeply depressed right now. A basic law of physics called the First Law Thermodynamics says a familiar equation, a familiar statement that energy can neither be created nor destroyed. So when this concept is applied to living systems, we have the familiar equation that calorie intake minus expenditure equals calories stored. Humans store virtually all of their excess calories as fat, so we can change this end of the equation to change in adiposity. Now, the conventional understanding of obesity holds that the problem, that excessive weight gain, is a failure in an individual's ability to control their own energy balance. So that in an environment with ubiquitous tasty foods, we've just heard about them, it's easy to consume too many calories, but we also in our modern environment don't have enough opportunity to burn off those calories, so they tend to build up in the bloodstream. Calorie-rich fuels like glucose, lipids, fats, and other substances. They build up, they have nowhere to go because we're not burning them, so they get forced into fat tissue, making fat tissue anabolic, or making it grow, and thus we gain weight and become fat. So the simple solution is, we've heard it a million times, eat less and move more. In fact, very simple. In fact, if you can't do it, our culture says there must be something the matter with you. At least lack of willpower, poor self-esteem, maybe a character issue, perhaps explaining why this particular medical problem is subject to bias and stigmatization in a way that few others are. But really, it sounds very simple. Just eat less and move more. This view, again, emphasizes the individual's responsibility to control their own energy balance. The USDA, Food Guide, My Plate website, says that reaching a healthier weight is a balancing act. The secret is learning how to balance your energy in and your energy out. Now, if you want to do this, a low-fat diet is going to be your best friend because fat has more than twice the calories of the other nutrients, protein and carbohydrate. Our first food guide pyramid in the United States, 1992, said to consume all fats sparingly and instead load up on these mostly processed carbohydrates. Do you remember 6 to 11 servings a day of this stuff? Of course, things didn't work out so well. Now, this slide doesn't prove cause and effect, but they show an interesting relationship. That from about the time we were counseled to reduce dietary fat, and in fact, the food industry jumped into that campaign with a vengeance, creating all of these low-fat foods that had just sugar and starch. Calories from fat consumed came down as the obesity epidemic exploded. Again, it doesn't prove cause and effect, but it suggests that continuing to focus on reducing dietary fat as our primary approach to obesity prevention and treatment is unlikely to lead us where we want to go. And recent research has suggested that this campaign was not only ineffective, but probably harmful. The largest low-fat diet study ever done, and probably ever will be done, the Women's Health Initiative clinical trial, put 50,000 women onto either a low-fat diet or a control group. Now, this diet was severely biased in its design. It was really a very poorly designed study from the perspective of looking at a low-fat diet, because these individuals got intensive support encouragement to eat fruits and vegetables, 16 individual and group counseling sessions. The control group got written educational materials. So if you just put somebody into a room once a week and you just have them meditate on their weight, they're going to lose a few pounds. That's called the Hawthorne effect. And in fact, they did see a 2-kilo weight decrease for 1 year, virtually completely lost thereafter. So from the perspective of reducing body weight or a range of other chronic diseases, the Women's Health Initiative clinical trial was a failure. In fact, there are now much better studies that fairly compare low-fat and high-fat diets with equal intensity of treatment, and they're consistently showing that these low-fat diets produce less weight loss than either all high-fat diets, very low carbohydrate diets, Mediterranean diets, all of which are higher in fat. Again, raising the possibility that our primary approach to nutrition, the low-fat diet, has caused major public health harm. We know that almost nobody can lose weight and keep it off over the long term through conventional calorie-restricted approaches. This is an NHANES, a national survey in the United States, self-report that said only 1 in 6 people with high body weight ever have lost just 10% of their body weight for just 1 year. That's a small proportion of the population burden of obesity, and it's probably an exaggeration because in self-reports we all think we're a little taller and a little thinner than we really are. Same issue in pediatrics. Very poor success. So we have to ask, why has this very simple equation, just this very simple approach, just eat a little less, move a little more? According to sophisticated energetic calculations, you just have to shift that energy gap by about 150 calories a day. You just have to burn off about 150 calories more than you take in for a weight problem to disappear in virtually anybody within a few years. Why has this been a failure in practice? It's so simple. Well, the obvious problem is that this calorie in, calorie out model ignores a century of research well known in the laboratory, which has not penetrated the weight loss clinic or the public health perspective. That body weight is controlled more by biology than willpower over the long term. In fact, we have primal, overlapping, redundant weight control systems involving the brain, multiple organs in the body, hormones, neurological impulses, and metabolic fuel signals that serve to control body weight. So when an individual at a particular weight, be that a lean weight or an obese weight, gets put onto tries to lose weight, either in a research study, they're restricted, or they try to do it themselves, of course they're going to lose weight at first. That's the law of thermodynamics. But what's going to happen? Their hunger is going to rise. And hunger isn't a fleeting feeling, it's a primal biological signal. Very difficult to ignore. But if you could ignore it over the long term, your body fights back in other ways with slowing metabolism. So this combination of rising hunger, slowing metabolism, and I'm not showing this, but also stress hormone secretion, is a recipe for failure, for weight regain. But the opposite also occurs in overfeeding studies with volunteers who agree to be force-fed, hundreds or 1,000 calories extra. They will gain weight. Again, a law of physics. But what happens? They lose all interest in food. All of the remarkable products that Michael showed us lose their appeal. They have no attraction for us, a point we'll come back to. They actively don't want to eat. They feel just as miserable as the people in the starvation studies. Their metabolism speeds up in the body's attempt to shed these extra calories. And once the protocol ends, to their great relief, their weight comes right back down to where it started. So we have this notion of a body weight set point that seemingly is determined in part by our genetics. But genes can't be the whole story, right? Why has this level of defended body weight, why is this weight that our body's fighting to maintain, gone up year after year in the last 30 or 40 years. We're defending a body weight about 35 pounds higher than we were in the United States, that is, a little less in Canada, than in the 1970s. Most importantly, what can we do about it? Well, we know that this basic law of physics can't be wrong, that equates overeating, under low energy expenditure, and fat storage. That equation can't be wrong, law of physics. But maybe our assumptions about causality are the problem. So that maybe the arrows don't point from left to right, they point from right to left. This would still fulfill the law of thermodynamics. It doesn't violate any physical principles, but it has profoundly different implications. So according to this way of thinking, something has triggered our fat cells to take in and store too many calories. And thus, there are too few, not too many. In the old paradigm, there's too many calories in the blood getting forced into fat cells. By this way of thinking, there's actually too few calories in the blood. Your fat cells are on a feeding frenzy, so the rest of your body is actually starving. You know, the brain doesn't see the calories stored in the fat cells. The brain sees the calories available to it to fuel metabolism. That's why we get hungry. And that's why our metabolism slows down. The brain is trying to help us conserve, thinking that we're in a famine. And it does this by making us tired. What happens when you're on a low-calorie diet? You get tired. Just as you're supposed to get on that treadmill, you're more likely to collapse on the couch. If you're going to move anywhere, it's going to be toward the refrigerator. And it gets worse. The brain also alters your metabolism in ways that slows down your resting metabolic rate and makes every movement that you do more efficient. So from this perspective, eating less and moving more is nothing more than symptomatic treatment doomed to failure in an environment with an abundance of calories. So what's triggering our fat cells, according to this theory, into calorie storage overdrive? The obvious culprit is too much insulin. I call insulin the miracle grow for your fat cells, just not the sort of miracle you want to have happening in your body. So this is well known, endocrinology 101. A child with type 1 diabetes who can't make enough insulin will invariably come to attention with weight loss, no matter how much that child is eating, 5,000, 10,000 calories more than normal. Give that child the right amount of insulin and the weight trajectory returns to normal. Give him too much insulin and he will predictably gain weight. And what's triggering all this insulin secretion? Again, the obvious culprit is the carbohydrates we're eating, the processed carbohydrates especially, that flooded our diet during the low-fat years. So this is not just the total amount that's gone up as we've decreased the proportion of fat, but also something called the Glycemic Index, which was initially defined by David Jenkins, who's just across town, which reflects how rapidly carbohydrates melt into sugar, as Michael had referred to, from potato chips. Potatoes has about the highest glycemic index of any food. All starches are made of glucose in a long chain, but when they're highly processed or highly hybridized, as is the white russet potato, highly hybridized to make the perfect French fry, these foods, bagel, white rice, prepared breakfast cereals, the low-fat cookies, they melt into sugar literally in minutes after consumption. So what happens in the body? Let's have a look at 3 different meals, varying in carbohydrate amount and processing. So one meal, this was done in adolescents on 3 different days. The adolescents were obese. And on one day, they were given instant oatmeal with a little milk and sugar. Now, this was made from a whole kernel grain. We had it prepared ourselves. We had it milled ourselves. So it was whole kernel, a whole grain, but just highly processed. So remember that term when you see whole grain. It can be very misleading. We compared that to steel-cut oats. That's the old-fashioned method. It maintains the kernel structure mostly intact. It takes a half hour to cook. Nobody has time for that anymore, although there are some tricks. You can soak the oats overnight, as we discuss in our book. And, but these two meals, the first two oatmeals, had the same protein, fat, carbohydrate, calories, just the same. And the third was a vegetable omelet that had more protein and fat and less carbohydrate, no starch at all. Okay, so what happens? Same calories, but after the highly processed carbohydrate instant oatmeal, insulin rises a lot faster and a lot higher. What that's going to do is, after this initial surge in blood sugar, because blood sugar will surge after these fast digesting carbohydrates, but that insulin is sending those calories into storage sites, importantly including into fat cells. And so blood sugar starts coming down and then crashes a few hours later. This was a statistically significant difference. But there's another double whammy. Fatty acids, that's really your most potent fuel. It's the main fuel you use when you're fasting. Fatty acids are suppressed after you eat, but stay suppressed longer. So these two key fuels are lower, even though you ate the same number of calories, these two key fuels are lower, consistent with the prediction in this new hypothesis, that the body's running out of fuel. And is this biologically significant? Look what happened to epinephrine, or adrenaline. That's an emergency stress hormone, secreted at times of fight or flight, but also secreted at times of hypoglycemia. Hypoglycemia is, from an evolutionary perspective, a greater threat to our well-being than would be a saber-toothed tiger, through history. And despite, again, the fact that they got the same calories, epinephrine surged to very high levels only after this high glycemic meal. When we gave subjects free access to food, they consumed 600 or 700 calories more after the instant oatmeal, and that's enough to explain the whole obesity epidemic, even if a fraction of that difference were maintained meal after meal, day after day. Now, let's ask what's happening in the brain when blood sugar and fatty acids, these key fuels, drop to low levels and adrenaline surges. So we looked at this by giving another group of participants milkshakes that had the same, again, protein, fat, carbohydrate. In one case, fast digesting carbohydrate, corn syrup. And in the other case, slow digesting carbohydrate in the form of uncooked cornstarch. So that happens to be a form of starch that the body takes a while to digest. These two milkshakes tasted the same. We controlled their sweetness. And so nobody knew the difference, the participant nor the investigator. As expected, we saw the surge and crash in blood sugar and increasing hunger after the fast-acting milkshake. And then we did brain scans 4 hours later. Now, this wasn't right around the meal. This wasn't when you're eating the Cheez-Its and it's melting in your mouth and all of these immediate neurological circuits are acting up. This is 4 hours later. We saw one area light up like a laser. It's called the Nucleus Accumbens. That's considered ground zero for the classic addictions, cocaine, heroin, alcoholism, smoking, raising a provocative idea that these foods are triggering a process akin to food addiction. Food addiction, not because they're inherently so tasty. Both of these milkshakes tasted the same. We could manipulate that in the laboratory. But through their biological effects. Now, it's one thing to be hungry, but this is a whole different part of the brain. This has to do with rewards and cravings. So if you're hungry and your nucleus accumbens is acting up, you're going to perceive Cheetos and these other processed foods as much tastier than they really are. Remember, palatability isn't an inherent aspect of food. If you get, after a big Thanksgiving dinner, foods that buttery stuffing that was delicious before the meal becomes entirely unappealing after you've eaten too much. Palatability is an internal psychological response. It's not something internal to food. And this study suggests that we can take back control over sugar, salt. I'll leave all fat right now. We can take back control over these highly processed foods very quickly. In other words, if you just stop eating them, they lose an ability to control our basic neurological response systems. All right, let me turn to an animal model. In humans, you can't control everything. There's just too many variations, even in short-term studies. But in animal studies, which I don't, I think that there's major problems with interpreting animal data to human obesity. But I'll show you this one study, and you can decide for yourself its relevance. We took rats that were at risk for diabetes, and we again gave them identical diets, same protein, fat, carbohydrate, with the only difference being one group got slow digesting carbohydrate and the other group got fast digesting carbohydrate. And we tried to keep their weight the same through the 16 weeks of the study. 16 weeks, that's sort of like 10 rat years, if you will. So you can see that the two groups, their average weight stayed exactly the same. But to accomplish that, we had to put the high glycemic index, the fast digesting carbohydrate fed rats, onto a low-calorie diet. We had to cut back their food intake because their metabolism had begun to slow down on its own, and they would have become obese. So we restricted their food intake, which is what we're told to do, to prevent excessive weight gain, and we succeeded. Despite that, at the same weight, the animals had 70% more fat, and thus they had an equivalent degree of reduction in their lean tissue. Now I'm going to show you my one graphic slide. Fortunately, we're not immediately after lunch. These two animals weighed exactly the same. The one on the left got the slow-acting carbohydrate and had virtually no visceral belly fat. The one on the right got the fast-acting carbohydrate, and its belly filled up with this fat. It had less muscle, and it had sky-high diabetes and heart disease risk factors. There's no way that you can explain this finding according to the conventional calorie-in, calorie-out model of obesity. Because what that model says is, if you're gaining excessive weight, just cut back calories and prevent the weight gain. We did that, and despite that fact, these animals were in profoundly different health states. All right, can we see any metabolic effects like this in humans? To look at that, we put 21 young adults with high body mass index, first on a weight loss diet. We brought their weight down by 10 to 15%, brought their weight down, stabilized them at this new lower body weight, and then put them for a month at a time on either a low-fat diet, a high-fat diet like Atkins with a whopping 60% carbohydrate, or an intermediate, a low glycemic index diet, sort of a Mediterranean diet. And here's what we found. The individuals, now this was a crossover study, so remember everybody got each of these diets in random order. Before weight loss, this is baseline, their total calorie expenditure was 3,200 a day, a little more. That's a lot, but these were big people. With weight loss on the low-fat diet, their metabolism plummeted by more than 400 calories a day. When they shifted to the low-carbohydrate diet, there was actually no significant decline in calorie burn at all. It was like their body didn't know that they had lost 10 to 15% of their weight. Their metabolism was just cruising along fine. So they're going to be feeling more energetic, probably less hungry, probably more likely to stay on the diet. And this difference, 325 calories a day, again, that could explain the whole obesity epidemic, even without postulating a change in food intake. All right, so let me sort of aim a landing with this talk by coming back to the studies that have given us the notion that you can lose weight on any diet. It doesn't matter what you eat as long as you cut back calories. The composition of the diet doesn't matter. You just have to stick with it. This notion comes from the big behavioral weight loss studies, such as Pounds Lost, which was done at two academic centers in the United States, with 800, so a lot of people, studied for 2 years, assigned to diets that were intended to differ widely in their nutrient composition. 35 to 65% carbohydrate, 20 to 40 fat, 15 to 25 protein. These are big differences. Not as big as we got in that study I just showed you, but these are big enough so that if you don't see something here, it would really question whether changing what you eat, the composition of what you eat, could really matter. And the conclusion of this, and they gave people behavioral counseling. So they didn't provide them with foods. They didn't teach them to cook. They just told them, eat this, not that. They sat with the dietitian and got advice. And they found that none of the groups showed any differences in weight loss. They all lost a little bit of weight, but there was no differences. Again, this study has been cited more than any other as evidence that it doesn't matter what diet you follow. And that is a false conclusion for one simple reason. The study failed to achieve anywhere near their targeted nutrient differences. Remember, I showed you how big the intended differences were. Self-report. So this is when you ask participants in the study, what are you eating? They reported the highest difference through the study, just the 1 point that was the highest, 9% difference in fat and 5% in protein. And this is also likely to be exaggerated, because if you recruit people into a study and you say, eat a low-fat diet, and then you give them financial compensation to participate, and then you ask them, what are you eating? What are they going to say? That's called a social desirability bias. When you look at the process measures, the biomeasures, the signs in the body that really let you know what's happening, it suggests that they were all eating pretty much the same thing. Triglycerides is a sensitive marker of carbohydrate intake, no difference between any group at any time of the study. Nitrogen excretion, which is a sensitive marker of protein intake, no significant difference. This was the direct study done at a nuclear power facility in Israel, where workers came in during the day, they checked in, they stayed there the whole day, and like America in the 1950s, the company fed them their meals. So this was an opportunity for the researchers to partner with the kitchen to create diets that really differed substantially. And in this case, again, a low-fat diet, a low-carb diet, or a Mediterranean diet. They didn't change what they were eating at home, but this will show you what you can see even with one major meal of the day different, which is rapid weight loss on the low-carbohydrate diet with some weight regain, slower weight loss on the medium-fat Mediterranean diet, but then it caught up, so maybe the tortoise and the hare. And the low-fat diet was out swimming somewhere in the Dead Sea, coming in last. And I'll skip this, but there are other studies where food is provided, where you can actually change what people are eating. Again, you consistently see benefits of reducing that processed carbohydrate. Okay, so I've told you that according to an alternative way of thinking, all of the processed carbohydrate we're eating is raising insulin, driving our fat cells into a feeding frenzy, causing us to experience a state of starvation inside the body. That not only makes us hungry, but it activates the reward, craving, and addiction centers of the brain, making these processed foods much tastier than they really are. And that drives food intake, and it lowers energy expenditure. But in addition to processed carbohydrates, there are other aspects of our diet I'm not going to talk about today, which can also influence fat cell behavior. So the kinds of fats we're eating, the amount and type of protein we're eating. We don't want to overdo the protein. Protein can cause insulin secretion, so that 16-ounce steak is not fully compatible with this, this approach. Prebiotics, probiotics, micronutrients, phytochemicals, and non-dietary factors like sleep, stress, and physical activity also can affect the system. So in summary, improving diet quality may be less arduous and more successful than calorie restriction over the long term. A simple approach to lowering insulin is to reduce the amount of total carbohydrate, or more importantly, focus on the quality of that carbohydrate. So this does not require us to go back to Atkins, but it does require a focus on these value-added foods that the food industry loves. They love plant sugars, or the things that break into plant sugars. They're cheap, they recruit these systems, but eating less on those foods is a losing proposition. And we ultimately need much better research to test diet as we would in any other area of research. So my last slide, I'd like to acknowledge that these thoughts you may find provocative, but they're not new. The editors of a leading medical journal wrote the following. When we read that the fat woman has the remedy in her own hands, or rather between her own teeth, there is an implication that obesity is merely the result of unsatisfactory dietary bookkeeping. Although logic suggests that body fat might be decreased by altering the balance sheet through diminished intake or increased output, or both, the problem is really not so simple and uncomplicated as it is pictured. So this was written by the editors of the journal JAMA in 1924. Thank you for your attention.